Long time ago, in the ancient town in Africa, lay the village of Afra. For generations, the people of Afra lived in harmony with the land, worshipping the great python deity, Asabo, who was believed to be the protector of the village. Asabo's presence was felt in every corner of the village, from the fertile soil that yielded bountiful harvests to the clear streams that flowed with life. The villagers revered the giant python with unwavering devotion, offering prayers and sacrifices to ensure the balance of nature was maintained. In return, Asabo blessed the village with prosperity and peace. The village's harmony was further guarded by Kofi, a wise dwarf wizard whose powers were unmatched. Despite his small stature, Kofi was a giant in wisdom and strength, and his connection to the mystical forces of the land made him a revered figure among the villagers. The worship of Asabo became the cornerstone of Afra's existence. The villagers knew that as long as they honored the python deity, their crops would flourish, their livestock would thrive, and peace would reign in their community. Asabo's presence was a constant reminder of the delicate balance between the human world and the natural world, a balance that could not be disturbed without grave consequences. Generations passed, and Afra continued to prosper under the protection of Asabo. The village was led by Chief Ndum, a man who had once been known for his wisdom and fairness. However, as the village grew richer, so did Ndum's lust for power and wealth. What began as a desire to improve the village gradually transformed into an insatiable hunger for more gold, more land, more control. The village elder, a dwarf wizard named Kofi, observed these changes with a heavy heart. Kofi was not just a wise man but also a guardian of the village's spiritual traditions. He could sense the disturbance in the village's spiritual balance, a disturbance that grew stronger with each passing day as Ndum's greed deepened. One day, Chief Ndum summoned Kofi to his palace. The chief's face was stern, his eyes burning with ambition. "Kofi," he said, "you possess great power. Use your magic to increase the wealth of this village. I want Afra to be the richest land in all of Africa, with me as its most powerful ruler." Kofi frowned, understanding the gravity of what Ndum was asking. "Chief, wealth is not something that should be sought without caution. Our prosperity is tied to our harmony with the land and Asabo, the guardian of our village. If we disrupt that balance, we risk losing everything." But Ndum was determined. "You are a wizard, Kofi. Surely you can do what I ask. The people will benefit from our riches, and I will ensure that our enemies never dare to challenge us." Reluctantly, Kofi agreed, knowing that he could not openly defy the chief. However, he warned Ndum again, "If you pursue wealth without regard for the balance we have maintained, the consequences will be dire. Asabo watches over us, and we must honor the python deity as we have always done." Ndum nodded but dismissed the warning from his mind. He was already envisioning the riches that would soon flow into his coffers. With Kofi's magic, Afra's prosperity grew beyond anything the villagers had ever imagined. The fields yielded bountiful harvests, the herds multiplied, and traders from distant lands flocked to the village, bringing with them treasures and goods. Ndum's wealth increased exponentially, and soon he was the richest man in the region. But with wealth came greed, and Ndum's desire for more grew stronger with each passing day. He began hoarding his riches, building grand structures to display his wealth, and demanding more from his people. The villagers, once content and united, started to grumble as they saw their leader growing distant and cold. Kofi, observing these changes, approached Ndum once more. "Chief, you have gained much, but you are beginning to lose the trust of your people. Remember the warning I gave you, wealth should be shared with the community, and we must continue to honor Asabo, for it is by Asabo's grace that we thrive." But Ndum had become arrogant. "Kofi, you are too cautious. Look at all we have accomplished. The people may grumble, but they will thank me in time. As for Asabo, the rituals are old traditions. We have moved beyond such superstitions." Kofi knew then that Ndum was too far gone, but he continued to perform his duties, hoping that the chief would come to his senses before it was too late. As Ndum's greed consumed him, the sacred grove began to fall into neglect. The once regular offerings and rituals became sporadic, and the altars where the villagers had once honored Asabo were left to decay. The python deity, who had watched over the village for centuries, began to sense the growing imbalance. Ominous signs started to appear. Crops that had once grown in abundance began to wither. Livestock fell ill for no apparent reason. The weather, once predictable and mild, turned erratic, with unseasonal storms and droughts causing havoc in the village. The villagers, growing increasingly anxious, approached Chief Ndum with their concerns. But Ndum, blinded by his own ambitions, dismissed their fears. "These are natural occurrences," he insisted. "They have nothing to do with our prosperity. Focus on your work, and everything will be fine." But the villagers knew better. They could feel the unease in the air, the sense that something was terribly wrong. Amara, Ndum's only daughter, was deeply troubled by the changes she saw in her father and the village. She had always been close to the land, spending her days in the fields and the forests, and she could sense the growing disharmony. She knew that the villagers were right, their neglect of Asabo and the sacred grove was the cause of their suffering. Amara tried to speak to her father, pleading with him to return to the old ways, to restore the rituals and honor Asabo as they once had. "Father, I beg you," she said. "The land is crying out for us to return to our roots. We must make amends before it is too late." But Ndum would not listen. "You are young and naive, Amara," he replied. "These are just stories from the past. We are the masters of our destiny now. Leave these matters to me." Frustrated and desperate, Amara turned to Kofi, seeking his counsel. The dwarf wizard, though weary from his efforts to maintain the village's fragile balance, offered what guidance he could. "Your father's heart has been hardened by greed," Kofi told her. "The path he is on leads only to ruin. But perhaps there is still time to save him, if he can be made to see the error of his ways." Amara vowed to continue trying, but deep down, she feared that her father was already lost. As the village's suffering grew, so did Asabo's anger. The giant python, once a benign protector, began to make its presence known in more menacing ways. It appeared at the edges of the village, its massive coils visible in the darkness, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The villagers, who had once revered Asabo, now cowered in fear, believing that the python had turned against them. Natural disasters struck with increasing frequency and intensity. Torrential rains flooded the fields, destroying the crops. Droughts followed, turning the once fertile land into a barren wasteland. Plagues of insects devoured what little remained, and the villagers began to fall ill, their bodies wasting away from malnutrition and disease. The people of Afra were terrified, convinced that Asabo had cursed them for their neglect. They begged Chief Ndum to restore the rituals, to make the necessary sacrifices to appease the angry deity. But Ndum, now fully consumed by his pride and greed, refused to admit his mistakes. "We will not be slaves to a snake," he declared. "We will find another way to restore our fortunes. I will not bow to a beast, no matter how powerful it may be." As the village's plight worsened, Ndum grew increasingly desperate. His once grand palace, filled with treasures, had become a prison of his own making. The gold and riches he had accumulated could not buy the prosperity that was slipping through his fingers. The more he tried to assert his control, the more everything around him crumbled. In his desperation, Ndum once again turned to Kofi, demanding that the wizard use his magic to reverse the disasters. But Kofi refused. "Magic cannot undo what has been done," he said gravely. "The land is suffering because the balance has been broken. You must restore that balance, Chief, or all will be lost." But Ndum, unwilling to admit defeat, dismissed Kofi's advice. Instead, he began to explore other means to save his power and wealth, even as the village teetered on the brink of destruction. Determined to regain control, Ndum decided to take matters into his own hands. Despite Kofi's warnings and the growing unrest in Afra, Chief Ndum's heart remained hardened. His desperation to maintain his wealth and power consumed him entirely. Rather than heeding the advice of Kofi or the pleas of his daughter Amara, Ndum turned to darker methods. Believing that Asabo, the giant python, was the source of all his problems, Ndum hatched a plan to rid himself of the deity once and for all. Ndum secretly contacted a group of mercenaries from a distant land, known for their ruthlessness and skill in hunting dangerous beasts. He offered them a substantial reward in gold and promised them a share of the village's riches if they could kill Asabo. The mercenaries, enticed by the prospect of such wealth, agreed to help Ndum. They began to prepare, gathering weapons and setting traps near the sacred grove, all while keeping their presence hidden from the villagers. One moonless night, Ndum led the mercenaries to the sacred grove, where Asabo was believed to reside. The grove, once a place of worship and reverence, now stood as a battlefield. The mercenaries set up their traps, laying bait and sharpening their weapons, while Ndum watched from the shadows, his heart filled with a twisted sense of triumph. As the mercenaries sprang their attack, they were met with more than they bargained for. Asabo, sensing the treachery, unleashed his wrath. The giant python moved with terrifying speed and power, striking down the mercenaries one by one. The battle was fierce, but Asabo's divine strength proved overwhelming. The mercenaries, despite their skill and preparation, were no match for the ancient deity. Their weapons shattered, and their traps were rendered useless. Asabo crushed them beneath his coils, their screams echoing through the night. Ndum, hiding in the shadows, watched in horror as his plan unraveled. The mercenaries, whom he had paid handsomely, were defeated, and Asabo remained unscathed. But rather than flee, Ndum's pride and desperation drove him to one final act of defiance. After the failed attack, Ndum retreated to his house, shaken but not yet defeated. He paced back and forth, his mind racing for another plan. But deep down, he knew that he had made a grave mistake. He had not only failed to kill Asabo, but he had also doomed himself by betraying the sacred bond between the village and the python deity. As Ndum contemplated his next move, a chilling silence fell over the village. The air grew thick and heavy, as if the very atmosphere was charged with anger. Suddenly, the ground beneath Ndum's house began to tremble. The walls creaked, and the candles flickered as a shadow fell across the room. Ndum turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. There, in the doorway of his home, loomed Asabo. The giant python had come to confront Ndum alone. Its massive body coiled through the entrance, filling the room with an overwhelming presence. Its eyes, glowing with a cold, merciless light, locked onto Ndum. The chief's breath caught in his throat as he realized there was no escape. Ndum, paralyzed by fear, stumbled backward as Asabo slithered closer. The python's hiss was deafening, a sound that reverberated through Ndum's very soul. Asabo's gaze was unrelenting, piercing through Ndum's facade of power and revealing the cowardice and greed that had consumed him. In a desperate attempt to save himself, Ndum fell to his knees, begging for mercy. "Great Asabo, forgive me," he cried, his voice trembling. "I was wrong. I will restore the village, I will honor you, please, spare me." But Asabo was unmoved. The python deity had given Ndum every chance to repent, and now it was too late. Without a sound, Asabo struck, its powerful jaws closing around Ndum. The chief struggled briefly, his screams muffled as the python began to swallow him whole. The process was slow, deliberate, as Asabo ensured that Ndum's final moments were filled with the terror of knowing that his greed and betrayal had led him to this fate. The village, sensing the ominous presence of Asabo, remained eerily silent. The people huddled in their homes, unaware of the events unfolding in their chief's house. When Asabo finally consumed Ndum, the python silently retreated, leaving no trace of the chief behind. The following morning, the villagers awakened to find that Chief Ndum was missing. Rumors quickly spread that Asabo had taken him, a just punishment for his arrogance and greed. The village was left leaderless, but a sense of relief washed over the people. They realized that the source of their suffering had been removed, and they began to understand the importance of restoring their connection to the land and to Asabo. Amara, Ndum's daughter, emerged as a new leader, guiding the village with wisdom and humility. Under her leadership, the village returned to its old ways, rebuilding the sacred grove and renewing their worship of Asabo. The villagers came together, sharing what they had, and the land began to heal. Crops grew once more, the rivers flowed freely, and the balance was restored. Years later, the story of Ndum's downfall was told as a warning to future generations. The tale of the greedy chief who sought to defy a god became a lesson in the dangers of pride, greed, and the folly of trying to control forces beyond one's understanding. The villagers of Afra never forgot the day Asabo claimed Ndum, and they continued to honor the giant python with reverence and respect. Asabo remained the guardian of the village, a reminder of the power and wisdom of the natural world. The people of Afra, led by Amara and guided by the memory of Kofi's teachings, lived in harmony with the land, knowing that to defy the balance was to invite destruction.